Hello and welcome to the History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and if you would like to listen to this or previous episodes of the programme, go to nearpodcast.org/pcast/. I'm joined as always by my co-presenter John Dorney from the irishstory.com website. This week we are very pleased to be joined by Professor David Fitzpatrick of Trinity College Dublin. Professor Fitzpatrick has edited a new collection of essays by the Trinity History Workshop and published by Lilliput Press called Terror in Ireland 1916-1923. Professor Fitzpatrick, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
One of the first questions raised by the book is, what is terrorism and how do we define it?
Well, we've applied a very broad definition of terror and terrorism, essentially embracing terror, a climate of fear being created by any source, whether it's the state or paramilitaries, Republican, loyalist or otherwise. So we don't suggest that it's coming in any particular direction. Our concern is the ways in which fear was aroused among particularly civilian populations and minorities who were affected by the extraordinary events of the revolutionary period.
What would you say about some people who would define terrorism as strictly non-state actors, wouldn't take into account, say, for example, the use of terror by a state while prosecuting a war, trying to suppress a rebellion?
Well, I think it's not up to historians to make judgments of a moral character, condemning or accepting particular forms of terrorism. That's why we prefer to take an ecumenical approach. Leave it up to the reader to make the moral judgments. And instead, what we've tried to do is to establish the conditions under which various parties found it necessary to use terror, try to explain why that happened and what the consequences were for those affected by it.
Hi David, John Dorney here.
Hello, John.
Do you think that there's an objective definition of terrorism? I mean, in conflicts, people always call the other side terrorists as a term of abuse. But is there an objective difference between, say, conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, and what we call terrorism, do you think?
I don't think there's an objective difference, particularly when we're looking at unofficial wars where people differed fundamentally about whether a war was going on or not. It's extremely important to avoid that sort of judgment. So in this book we have chapters which look at the use of terror by the state, say in the reprisals which occurred in Balbriggan, where Ross O'Mahony and myself have both written accounts of the way in which civilians were punished and their interests damaged in September 1920, following the killing of two policemen. But we also have accounts of the effects of terror conducted by Republican paramilitaries in County Cork, in both Dunmanway and Kilmichael, and some of that terror was directed, it is argued, specifically against Protestants. So we're looking at many different ways in which terror was applied and many different communities and groups which suffered from it.
When we think of wars, we tend to think of some violence as being legitimate in a war. We think of combatant against combatant. Do you think something becomes terrorism when it targets non-combatants? Is that the crucial difference?
I think that terror can actually be applied to combatants as well as non-combatants. For example, in Jane Leonard's account of the killings of Bloody Sunday morning, the 21st of November 1920 in Dublin, you're looking at terror specifically directed against the persons believed to be intelligence agents. As she shows, less than half of those killed appear, in fact, to have been intelligence officers. But that's a case where you have a very specific group targeted. And the aim of that is a rational aim. It is to strike fear into all of those who might think of providing intelligence on behalf of the state. But I think that's less... Terror directed against combatants, particularly armed combatants, doesn't usually work very well, because combatants are in a position to some extent to defend themselves, to build barricades, to retreat into encampments where they can't easily be attacked. And so most terror in these informal wars that we're talking about in the case of Ireland 1916 to 23, most terrorists are in fact relatively vulnerable and undefended civilians.
Some of the essays in the book deal not just with violence but also with harassment and intimidation. What effect do you think this had on local populations?
Well, I think the effect of intimidation, of social ostracism, of threats and menaces is probably greater. It has a wider and devastating effect Killing's the tip of the iceberg, and relatively few people were killed in the Irish Revolution when you think of other European conflicts of the period. I don't know to what extent particular populations were actually driven out of Ireland as a result of terror. My own feeling is that because Irish populations, Catholic and Protestant, over so many centuries have got used to intimidation and menace, that they've become extraordinarily resilient. And although you'll have people fleeing their districts, a good many of them would come back again pretty quickly and settle into roughly the same environments and culture that they had left. And an example of that would be something we don't discuss in the book, unfortunately, because we had no contributors associated with Trinity College who could participate in the workshop. But that is the way that Catholic workers from the shipyards and engineering works in Belfast in a series of expulsions, 1920, 21, 22, and so on. They go back fairly quickly after the horrible period of arson and destruction has taken place. Now, some never went back, but there's more resilience than one would suspect on the basis of the propaganda put out by all sides.
When we think about Irish political violence, I think if you look at the 19th century and you look at the Fenian movement, you can see kind of two strands of thinking about political violence. In 1867, the Fenians are very concerned that they look like legitimate combatants, that they fight openly. But there's also a tradition which we associate with the Land League, or before that with secret societies, which is more to do with intimidation and nighttime raids and anonymous killings. And I think in the War of Independence, you can see continuities with both of those ideas. Would you agree there?
I think that's a very good point. The feeling that there was a sort of noble and honourable tradition, particularly of Republican rebellion and resistance, certainly came into conflict with the so-called agrarian tradition of violence and intimidation, and that led to a lot of friction between the Fenians and the agrarian rebels from the 1860s onwards. And during the period that this book concerns, I think there's a movement towards coarsening, shall we say, of the conduct of the Republican movement. Fergal McGarry, for example, in an early chapter in the book, discusses 1916 and finds that the rebels had a relatively clean record. In other words, they tried to adhere to what they thought was a conduct of honourable rebellion, laying down their own rules, basically. McGarry, in fact, I don't know whether he's right or not, but he puts the greater blame on the army for the killing of civilians and for acts of brutality and barbarism in 1916. And I think what you can see over the period is this sense of an honourable war conducted according to Boy Scout rules, if you like, becomes rather worn as the guerrilla campaign got underway and intensified in 1920 to 21. It became extremely difficult for either side to adhere to any a set of decent rules of combat. Now, the Republicans still believed that they were fighting a war as distinct from a rebellion, and Tom Barry is an example of somebody who was emphatic that that was what he was doing, and therefore that one must show proper consideration for prisoners and civilians, so that when he was presenting his memoir and trying to explain what he had done with the West Cork Brigade, he insists that its conduct was almost invariably honourable and in accordance with these rules, unlike the brutal, uncivilized behavior of the auxiliaries and the soldiers that were in combat with the West Cork Brigade. Now, I think that it's an understandable point of view on Barry's part to try to draw a link between the tradition of 1916 and what was happening at Kilmichael, for example, in 1920. But it's something which is difficult to sustain when one looks closely at the evidence. And that's what Eve Morrison has done in a discussion of the famous Barry claim that there was it was only as a result of the so-called false surrender of certain auxiliaries that they were killed when in what appeared to be a defenseless position, rather than taken prisoner. So that is the sort of consideration we have here, not making a judgment about the morality of Barry's conduct, but about the division between the legend that he created and the reality as it is slowly being unearthed through materials such as witness statements in the Bureau of Military History, together with interviews with survivors, which have at last become available in a wider form and are no longer anonymous.
Are you surprised that there is still so much debate and so much controversy, not just about Kilmichael, but on a whole range of other issues to do with this period that attracts so many column inches? It seems to have escaped the pages of academic journals, and it's out in the mainstream, people asking questions about issues like Kilmichael.
I do think it's extraordinary, certainly in international terms, that there is still such moral passion about what was going on. And of course, where you have people who believe very strongly in the morality of a certain sort of struggle, they will also believe strongly in the bad faith of those who deny that morality. And I think a lot of the bitterness which has crept into the debate recently, much of it directed against the work of my late and lamented student Peter Hart, it emerges from that. And of course, well, you then have to ask why is this still a matter of such moral importance for so many people in Ireland and beyond Ireland? And the answer must be some sense that the continuing struggles in Northern Ireland were a continuation of what happened in 1916 to 23. And for many people, if that earlier conflict were tainted, if it were not seen to be an honorable war prosecuted in a noble cause in a decent fashion, that would create problems for interpretation of the more recent movement in Northern Ireland particularly. So there's certainly an element of that, but it goes far beyond that. The public interest goes well beyond those who have any particular political position about Northern Ireland. And it involves a great many people who think that the Republic has gone wrong in some way. It's become tainted. Its politicians are crooks in the pockets of developers, that they've sold their country. And I think many people are looking back to a golden age when this was not the case, when you had clean, decent revolutionaries, not tainted in the way that their hypocritical successors in politics appear to be.
Going back for a second to the 1920s, we have talked about Republican paramilitaries and what they did. What Republicans themselves argued at the time was that they were living under what Todd Andrews called tyranny tempered by assassination. What do you think about state forces? Were they guilty of terrorism in this period?
Well, I believe in many cases they were, and for much the same reason that Republicans fell into terrorism. Now, there are different sorts of terror. I mean, there's strategic terror, which is planned in advance. For example, the property reprisals conducted in the martial law zone in 1921 were designed with a purpose, even though it may seem a horrible purpose. There was a logic to it. That is, that if you punish the families and shelterers of supposed Republican terrorists, then they will provide information, or they will no longer provide shelter for those terrorists. And Lloyd George appears to have thought that you could punish communities in order to isolate the gunmen and render them vulnerable to the Crown forces. So that is strategic terror. And the same can be found on the other side with campaigns against informers, so-called. If you can punish enough if you have enough exemplary punishments of informers, others will be afraid to pass information to the Crown forces. So that is rational terror in a sense. But there's also the irrational terror, which results from fear and ignorance. And of course there's no clear line between the two kinds, where actually you don't know who the informers are. You don't know who in the community is sheltering your opponents, but you suspect that you know. And that's where the danger comes, that whole villages will be punished, which are not complicit in so-called rebellion, or whole classes, such as Protestants, for example, in a locality may be punished because they're thought to be prone to become informers, even if the evidence isn't there. And it's in those conditions where you're being attacked, you know that information is leaking, that your enterprises are being foiled on both sides, that you begin to have aberrant and increasingly brutal behavior. secret assassinations by so-called anti-Sinn Féin gangs, or off-duty police being shot in the back or killed in a pub, this sort of thing. In other words, there's a psychological element to it. It's not just the psychology of fear created by the terrorist, but the psychology of insecurity which gives rise to terrorism.
I mean, if we look at the counterinsurgency throughout the period up until 1923, I think, would it be fair to say that whereas the British effort is not very successful, both the Northern Ireland and the Free State counterinsurgency are pretty successful? Would you agree with that, first of all, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think the success of a reprisal strategy or extreme coercion against targeted groups really depends on the degree to which the government is regarded as legitimate by citizens. And so you have the provisional government and the new Free State government conducting the most dreadful reprisals, I mean brutal and cynical reprisals against so-called irregulars and their supporters, but getting away with it without losing legitimacy, because it's considered that there's something worthwhile to come out of it. In other words, the use of what in normal circumstances would be seen as intolerable force, often against either the guiltless or the not very guilty, is justified by the emergency and by the widespread belief that it's worth creating a democratic state, a majoritarian state in the South. Now, I think the same applied in Northern Ireland, because after all, the result of partition was to carve up the country into two states, each of which had a very large majority, which dominated politics for decades to come. So the northern state now wasn't nearly as brutal in its suppression if you look at the number of executions, the number of arrests and internments, as the southern state in its early days. But it was brutal enough. It too could get away with it, even get away with the punishments administered to deviant unionists and loyalists, because of the massive popular and democratic support that it had acquired.
But in relation to something like the British Army, is there a case that once you let the genie out of the bottle in regards to repressions and reprisals, like as you've spoken there and you've written about Balbriggan, is it very hard then for an army to reinforce discipline within the ranks afterwards?
Yes, I think the result of the reprisals, there were two results. One was to make it extremely difficult to conduct any sort of policing operation. The army itself was held to be less undisciplined than the paramilitary police, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. But undoubtedly, once these had occurred and had been condoned by superior officers in many cases, while not actually directed by any central authority, it makes it extremely difficult to get things together. Now, in the martial law zone, to some extent that was achieved in 1921. There was a distinct improvement in the performance at the Crown Forces. But that was more than compensated for by the loss of legitimacy of the whole operation of the British government in Ireland. And I argue in my Balbriggan article that the result of reprisals like that was to convert non-Republican nationalists into strong opponents of British rule, because the conduct of the Crown Forces seemed to be worse than that of the Republicans. And I think that, and this is not simply a fiction created by Republican propaganda, although there was lots of that, it's also a fact that you have large numbers of houses, cottages being burnt down, people being attacked, one of the two big hosiery factories in Balbriggan being burnt to the ground with the loss of hundreds of jobs. All of this creates the feeling that you don't actually have a representative government at all, which is concerned with the welfare of Ireland. So my feeling is that the British government lost legitimacy over the period of the Revolution by stages. And by 1921, they really had few supporters, even among so-called loyalists, and hence the strange phenomenon of peers and landlords sending articles to the reviews praising the superior performance of the Republicans compared with the so-called British government in Ireland, because at least they kept the streets clean and sent out patrols at night.
I think one of the most controversial things of all in the whole period is the question of sectarianism. It was controversial then, and it's controversial now still. One thesis that was raised by the late Peter Hart is that when the IRA looked for informers, they looked disproportionately for Protestants, and there's a good chapter in the book which says that in West Cork that tended to be the case. What do you think of that argument?
I think that it's been somewhat overemphasized as part of Peter Hart's work. What he argued was that there were quite a number of groups which were identified by Republicans, particularly in Cork, which he'd studied most, as suspect. Not merely Protestants, but also travellers, army deserters, any kind of stranger was regarded as a potential threat to the national polity. Now, there's undoubtedly an element of sectarianism in what was going on. He may have overemphasized it somewhat, but what he did pick up on, and what was one of the great novelties of his work, was just what devastating effects that could have when the lid was taken off, so to speak. In other words, his idea was that among many assumptions, deep buried most of the time in the Irish Catholic mind, was that Protestants were really of a different stock, potentially anti-national, however much most of the time they would seem otherwise, and however well one might get on with them from day to day. And I think his study, particularly of the Dunmanway killings in April 1922, pointed to that, where you have a case where a dozen people were killed and all of them were Protestants. And the question is, why were they killed? He argued that there were all sorts of justifications which were put forward at the time. He argued, by the way, and documented this more fully than any of his adversaries, that many of them were believed to be informers, and that was a rationalization for killing them. Now, I think he probably went too far in emphasizing this sectarianism, because it's only in his broader story, it's just one of many fears and phobias that Republicans appear to have had about marginal or minority groups that weren't part of the community as they defined themselves.
Would it be fair also to say that this varies a lot from region to region in the War of Independence?
Well, undoubtedly. The kind of sectarian incidents that he described are not limited to Cork. But in every case, there is an ambiguity about the motives of those concerned. What he was talking about was much more the psychology of the killers than their conscious motivation. I doubt that any of these killings were done by people who said, I'm going to kill that person because he or she is a Protestant. It's a question of what guided the deeper process of decision-making, and that's something we can always disagree about, and passionate disagreement will continue to occur on that very topic. But the important thing is to assemble the evidence there is, put forward the case, but also provide the evidence which can refute that case. And that's what Peter Hart did in his book, with the ironic result that many of the attacks on his work are largely based on documents that he assembled himself.
Obviously, the events in Cork continue to be very controversial for a number of reasons, but something which is not talked about that much, I think, in general discourse, is that in the North, Catholics have their own story where they suffered what they consider to be a pogrom. You had incidents like the McMahon killings, where a family of 6 were targeted by what we think were off-duty policemen. So is that part of the story of terror in Ireland and sectarian terror?
Well, it undoubtedly is, but because this book is the work only of historians associated with Trinity, we had nobody to write about what was happening in the North. Now, there has been quite a lot of work done quite recently about this, and of course there's always the other side to the story. There's Alton of A, the killing of unprotected Protestants, as well as the McMahon murders. And Alan Parkinson, who's recently done a book on the British support for the anti-Home Rule movement for the war, he's also, I noticed in the paper the other day, argued that the term pogrom is unacceptable, that it's inapplicable to what was happening to Catholics in Belfast in 1922. That, in other words, there is not such a concerted movement as one would describe from Russian precedent as a pogrom. Rather, what you have are eruptions of violence in which paramilitaries on both sides are involved. But because of the, I suppose, what we call the demographic balance in the Belfast area, Catholics tended to suffer worse. So they're 1/3 of the population, but 2/3 of the victims are Catholic. Now that's something I would have liked to have had, an impartial dissection of that two-way movement of terror that occurred in Ulster.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our interview. Thank you very much, Professor David Fitzpatrick. The book is Terror in Ireland, 1916 to 1923, from the Trinity History Workshop, and that is published by Lilliput Press. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much.